Theodicy. Oh, what did I? Okay, got it. Okay, it said recording in progress.
Yeah, it was a
Yeah.
little slow on the uptake. I don't.
Okay. So there's types of evil and types of responses. So usually there's distinguished two types of evil: moral evil, that's wrongdoing of personal evil beings or suffering directly caused by that wrongdoing. Natural evil is suffering that is a result of the natural order of the world, such as suffering due to disease, earthquake, genetic defects, so on and so forth, that is not directly the result of anybody's wrongdoing. Now, often these get mixed together, right? There's a famine. Well, it's partially a natural cause, but also partially, you know, there's unfair distributions of food. So they can be mixed, two can be mixed together in any given situation. Then there's two types of responses to evil. I actually should add a third kind of response when dealing with the problem. There's what people call a pastoral response, and that is you attempt to be empathetic with the person, help them get through the evil. Then you might not want to, and you're doing a pastoral response, try to explain why God allows evil. That maybe comes in later, but it wouldn't be necessarily a good thing to do right off the bat.
Right.
So I'm going to be looking at the responses that try to resolve the conflict here. And one is a theodicy. That is an attempt to explain why God allows the kind of evils we find in the world. And then there's a defense. That does not attempt to explain why God allows evil. It merely tries to show that the evil we find in the world does not count heavily against the existence of God. So usually a defense proceeds like this. It says, well, God's mind is so much larger than our minds. God is so much wiser that even though we can't explain why an evil exists, doesn't mean there isn't an explanation. So usually if I give an example in class, like if you went to some rich person like Bill Gates's house, and in the basement, the children were in the basement and teeth were rotting out, and they were torturing each other, you would conclude he wasn't a good father. In that case, the conclusion is legitimate because the kind of reasons a human being might have for allowing evil. So then you think in your mind of all those possible reasons, you don't see any, then you can conclude that there probably isn't a reason. But in the case of God, we can't do that because God's mind is so much larger than ours. So that's been one standard response that doesn't try to give you a theodicy. Now, I think the best way of going is to throw out theodicies, and then those things that don't fit very well with theodicies then invoke a defense. So kind of a combination of theodicies plus a defense is the best way of dealing with it. And often we do have the other things, theodicies. One reason they're also helpful is, next slide here, is they have to do with the meaning of life. So what are we here for? Which is a question that can affect how we live. So I put here, evil presses the issue of the meaning of life. If there were not any evil, then the meaning of life would be obvious, in the same way it would be if we were in a heavenly state. Enjoy life, right? If there weren't any evil, yeah, enjoy life would be what it was all about. But then in the process of providing an account of why God allows evils, theodicies address the question of what the meaning of life is. So if you think it's all about the free will theodicy, then the purpose of, and the usual popular version of it, then the purpose of life is simply to choose God over not God. That's the sole purpose. So a lot of Christians think purpose of life is to make that choice. That's what we're here for. And we'll look in detail at that theodicy. Is there any, I'll get to this and ask if there's any questions. Further, as we will see, theodicies also help serve as a guide to action, telling us the eternal importance of actions. So if free will is the big deal, then it's a matter of making these free choices. And the internal importance is whether you spend eternity in a loving relationship with God or not. Is there any questions so far?
There is one question in the chat.
Okay, let me see chat. Okay. Okay, somebody asked about process theology. In process theology, God does not actually have the power to eliminate evil. God is not omnipotent. God's power is a power to influence what happens. So God influences people, and so God would not have the power to stop Hitler from doing what Hitler did. God couldn't have stopped it. God would have less power than, for example, Superman would have, or Wonder Woman. And so it presents a big problem because, in my mind, process theology, if you take it to its logic, take it to its conclusion, God is not the creator of the world, because certainly any being that could have created the universe would have that kind of power. And so you end up having to deny that God created the universe, only has power to influence the universe. Now, there's a modification of process theology in which God retains his omnipotence, or his or her omnipotence, but it's better for God typically acts by influencing, because God doesn't want to coerce us. So it's more loving or something for God to act that way. So then it's because there's a greater purpose God has. And so God doesn't want to override our free choices or compel humans to do things. So then you would develop a reason why God would do that.
Robin, I think of three things, three little mantras come to life. One is somewhere in the scripture, it talks about how we as Christians are to complete the suffering of Christ.
Right.
So you can make sense of that for me. And then I think of Julian of Norwich, who says sin is necessary. You can make sense of that for me. And then I think about, is it Galatians or Ephesians that talks about character being built, through basically, sort of what person are you if you've never hit a challenge, never, if everything has been hunky-dory, I would, what sort of backbone would you have? How would you even know who you are? So that's where
we'll get to that. And did you want me to try to answer that question about us?
Anytime you want.
Okay, bring it up towards the end just to make sure I get through it, because really that's part of, I have developed, it's connects with Eastern Orthodox theology, a participatory model of atonement.
Okay.
And in that, you can make sense of that verse, that we also participate with Christ in what I say, creating these sort of virtues that we can participate in. But I have to go into that issue of atonement. And it does connect up with this, the Theodicy I'll be presenting next week, my own Theodicy. This week, I'm kind of giving the background. Okay, so next week I get into what I call the connection building, or people said to call it the love Theodicy. So, but this week I'm just going through some of the standard things. I'll be ending with the soul-making Theodicy, what you had hinted at in the building of character.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So, and feel free to ask questions along the way. So this leads to some people, and most theodicies are based on this idea. It's looking at when you say God is perfectly good, what does that mean? How would that constrain God's actions? So we first look at the human case of what it is to be good, because when we say God is good, it has to have some connection with what we mean in human case when we say, you know, a person's good. If it doesn't, it loses all its meaning when applied to God. So when you apply an attribute to God, you're really taking that, the kind of core meaning of the attribute that's when applied to human beings, like knowledge or things like that, God being omniscient, all-knowing, and then you make it perfect in the case of God. Otherwise, you don't really know what you're talking about anymore. So a perfectly good human being would only allow an evil that they could easily prevent if allowing it is humanly necessary for a greater good or the prevention of a greater evil. So we can look at a perfectly good doctor in the Civil War, let's say down in Gettysburg, right? And so he's looking at these other people. They're taking somebody, you know, putting a piece of wood in the person's mouth, pull out his leg, and then start sawing it off. And a lot of suffering's occurring there. Well, how could that person be perfectly good, allowing that suffering and maybe even causing it? Well, we would say that was necessary to save the person's life. And so the greater good is saving the person's life, and they didn't have the kind of antibiotics then to do it another way. So on the other hand, you know, as an example I give to students, if you're lost in the woods in the Teton Mountains in the wilderness and there was no way of getting home and you're starting to get gangrene and you saw Dr. Collins's cabin and you knocked at the door and you saw that there was antibiotics and stuff on the shelf, and then you told him you had gangrene, and then, you know, Dr. Collins went and put you in the chair, strapped you, and then told you like doing things the old-fashioned way, and would still have saved your life, but wouldn't be a good doctor because there was an alternative way of doing it. So when applied to God, that you get this, what people call the greater good principle. And so it says an all good God would only allow a particular evil if God's allowing it is absolutely necessary for a greater good to exist. This means that not even God could bring about the greater good without allowing the evil in question. So in the gangrene example, of course, God could, you know, save the person's life without doing this. So it's really hard to find in that case greater goods that God just couldn't get without allowing the evil because of God's omnipotence. So the trick here is trying to find those that not even God could create a world with those greater goods without allowing the evil. So I have it this way. I do a diagram for it. God allows evil, particular evil. It's necessary. Usually there's some intermediate step here in the Theodicy. And then there's a greater good here. And then that greater good, greater good outweighs the evil. In other words, it's worth the cost. Like in the, if you sawed the person's leg off and for other reasons was only going to survive a few days, then it wouldn't be a greater good. You would be you would be extending their life maybe a few days, but it wouldn't be worth the suffering you were inflicting on them. So it has to be a greater good. So this is where the free will theodicy comes into play. That's a really nice illustration of it. This is the popular version. There's various versions of a free will theodicy. So God allows moral evil. Its focus is on initially moral evil. And that's necessary for morally significant libertarian free will. That's a big mouthful. What that means is morally significant means a choice between good and evil, which we can think of as a choice between God and not God. And libertarian free will is free will. So I hear a meowing or something. So libertarian free will is, okay, I was just Distracted by a cat meowing.
I don't know who that is.
Does
Is
somebody
that-
have their
Is that your
mic
cat?
on?
No,
They
I
have a
have no
cat?
cat. I have no cat.
Well, we'll just, okay. Am I the only one hearing this?
No,
I hear it. You might be the only one with a cat, Robin.
Everybody mute
Hi,
themselves.
Joey.
It should be okay.
Hi.
Hi, Rebecca.
Hi, Becca. My mother-in-law's here. So I really better shape up on this. Okay. So morally significant libertarian free will, it's a choice between good and evil. And libertarian means that the free will, nothing outside of you causes your choice. And a lot of people believe in a different kind of free will. So there's kind of a debate about that. Some people believe in what's called a compatibilist conception. And free will is basically doing what you want to do. And then something else could cause your wants and thereby determine what you do. So this requires a libertarian conception. And for Christians, that would mean it requires that God doesn't predestine us. So it's a choice between God and not God. Well, why is that choice so good? And usually, so the popular version says, well, that's necessary for authentic love of humans for God that lasts forever. So I do it into, to get students intuitions, I tell them about marketing thing I'm doing, which is what I call the love pill. And you give it to your kids and they'll love you the rest of their life. It kind of imprints you on them. And then I ask them how many would buy my love pill. I'm trying to get rich. And very few, usually some guy raises his hand. But very few people do. And the intuition is it wouldn't be true love, that true love somehow requires a free choice, not a forced choice. So that's how this works. And then it's a greater good because it lasts forever. So if something keeps going on forever and ever, then it's plausible to think the goodness of it outweighs any finite evil that God must allow to get that. So God has to allow a finite evil that only occurs, for a certain amount of time to get this. So that's the idea behind the free will theodicy. Now, I'm going to be raising some significant criticisms of it, why I don't think it really is adequate as a full-blooded theodicy. But is there any questions so far?
Robin, I have one, this free will to choose.
Mhm.
I'm having a little trouble understanding why a human being would choose the evil that we're talking about.
Yeah, well, people either say it's because of ignorance or there's some contrary desire. Like we're built with contrary desires, like, our own personal gratification. And so we choose, we choose our own personal gratification over what we know to be good. So we know that occurs. Why people do it is still, you could see also it's somewhat of a mystery, the mystery of iniquity, why people do evil. But we know people do it. Just look around at the world, right? But why would they choose that? Well, either ignorance of what the good is, or willful ignorance, it could be, or because of some conflicting desire. Does that make some sense?
Well, it does from a human evil, but there's a lot of evil, like an automobile accident that kills your wife and 2 kids, and you weren't at air. Where does that fit into this?
Yeah, that's a form of natural evil, and that's one of the problems with the free will theodicy, is it can't really explain natural evil. I mean, to get more extreme, there's things, floods, tsunamis, famines, disease that happens that no one's responsible for, like malaria parasite in the past in tropical countries killed about half the people.
Mhm.
So it was very devastating and still does kill a lot of people. So, and humans didn't create the malaria parasite. They didn't do it. It's not moral evil. So that would be one of the problems. And I'll get to some of the problems with it. Right now, it's just as an illustration of this greater good principle. That you
Thank
can
you.
see why God would have to allow moral evil for us to have this, and why this is necessary for that. So I'll get into the problems with that. So here's a sample application. I'm just going to ask you the greater good principle. Name one potential problem with claiming that God allows evil so we can appreciate heaven and other good things. Some people say that. So what would be a potential problem? More than one potential problem with that is an account of why God allows evil. Anybody?
For me, it sounds sadistic. If I made my children stay outside when it was freezing cold, just so they would appreciate the heat that I have inside. There's
Yeah,
something,
good. So it seems to violate another moral principle.
right, yeah.
That you shouldn't have do evil or allow harm just so that they'll appreciate you more.
Mhm, mhm.
And anything else?
One of the things that I encountered when I had cancer is I had a couple of people tell me that God gave me the cancer in order to teach me something.
Okay, so that's what I call the teaching theodicy,
Yeah.
right? Been in school too long. You go in that one, right? It's like endless graduate school. The world is an endless graduate school. And no, that would be similar to this, and there's a similar problem. What problem did you have with that?
So it enraged me because I did not believe that God gave me cancer.
Right. So first of all, you didn't think God gave you cancer, but maybe they could have weakened it and said God allowed you to have cancer.
Yeah, that would have been harder for me to refute, I suppose.
In the chat, Marty has made a comment that makes God malicious.
Right. So God, you're all getting to, there's a little thing, a kind of stronger version of the greater good principle that it's on the next slide, that people want to say that theodicies have to meet. You're getting to that issue, but let me just say another problem with this is certainly it looks like God could give us that appreciation or teach us that without the cancer, right? God could, say, well, look at what it could have been like, movie, what it would have been like if, if without me, right? So there's all other kinds of ways God could do that. And then there's a lot of evil, it seems overkill. Okay, I get the idea of what evil is. I don't need to go through a Holocaust, right? So there's all those kind of problems with it. When you start thinking about it, what evils doesn't it account for? Could God get it some other way? Is it really necessary? There's all those sorts of problems that immediately come up. Now I have this as the greater good principle plus. A lot of people want to do this, and that's where the maliciousness of God, you don't want to have a malicious God. And a general way of putting this is a perfectly good God would not allow the harm of someone without their consent, merely as a means to another's good. So put differently, a perfectly good God would not allow significant harm to occur to someone without their consent merely for the good of others. So people shouldn't be used as a means to an end. That's what we have a problem we have with terrorism, because terrorism uses people as a means to some political end. Even if the act of terrorism, let's say shooting the hostages, end up doing a greater good for society, overthrew a bad government, it would still be using their harm as a means to an end. So people have a strong intuition that's just wrong to do that. So that's a stronger principle. So I want to do now, before analyzing the free will theodicy more, some popular but inadequate theodicies you often hear. So punishment theodicy, suffering as punishment for personal sin. How many have heard of that kind of theodicy?
I'm sure.
The tsunami occurs, so
Well,
some disaster occurs, those people must have been, collectively in that country must have been sinning.
Well, and it doesn't it kind of tie from you reap what you sow? I mean, we do
Yeah.
believe there's punishment to, if I'm gonna start, stealing from people, one day I'll get caught and,
So there's a certain amount of truth to this. Some suffering is a result, is at least a result of sin,
mhm,
right?
mhm.
So if you're legitimately in prison and you're not happy about it, well, that's a
Yeah.
result of being a criminal.
Yeah,
But what people want to do with this is they want to globalize this and say everybody's getting what they deserve now. In scripture, you can immediately think of what the problems with this are, right? What does scripture say the problems with this are? Anybody?
Well, the book of Job refutes
The book
this
of Job.
entire idea.
Yeah, so it addresses this idea, the book of Job. Jesus addressed this like a man born blind. Whose sin was it? His parents? Because he's born blind. And, Jesus says neither. It's none of them, or the wall that fell. So Jesus actually refutes it. The psalmist, in the Psalms, you find the psalmist saying, why do the wicked prosper and the righteous suffer? So you do not see suffering distributed through the world in accordance with our personal sin. And that's why it bothers us so much. Now, the only way of getting this to work is to have a doctrine of reincarnation. So if you go to a Hindu or Buddhist system, then it's karma. So you really reap what you sow. So if you're born really poor and suffering, well, you did something wrong in your past life. And they often have there's whole books written on karma. What you do this, what its result will be in the future. So it's like, at some point in the future, this life or the future life, you will reap the fruits of that. So you can make this to work, but you're going to have to go into a kind of doctrine of reincarnation, which is not acceptable for Christians. So that's
I think Marty had her hand up.
yeah. Let me see, Marty.
I did, but I think the relevance may have passed. I was just going to comment that I had a relative through marriage who was dying of cancer and was told by her conservative church that if she would confess her sins and the sins of her family, her cancer would be healed.
Right. So that was another a punishment for personal sin, which is very unbiblical, as we see the book
Oh,
of
so
Job.
shocking.
Yeah.
Well, and like Jerry Falwell blamed, like there was an earthquake or something bad happened. And he said it was because America accepted gays.
Right. So I mean, it's unbiblical, doesn't make sense, but it's a huge temptation of people. It's a huge temptation of us to blame the victim somehow. And that temptation gets embedded in the Hindu reincarnation system, karma and reincarnation. It gets embedded in that, and as a whole metaphysical system of explaining suffering. I want to just make a clarification. I'm not saying a limited form of reincarnation is incompatible with Christianity. I'm saying that that kind of, reincarnation system is.
Hey, Robin, I have to confess that a few months ago, when everything that could go wrong was going wrong in Benno and Molly's family, I mean,
Mhm.
sickness, broken bone, I mean, surgery for whatever, it was, I just said, this is a time to get on your knees and confess your sins. I mean, I was ready, like, okay, let's start with cleaning house, that might help.
Right.
Who knows?
Well, one thing is one really unique thing about Christianity is it overturns that notion that suffering means you're on the wrong side of God. It
I
overturns
totally
it with the cross. I mean, with the cross, you know, the God man suffered on a cross.
Mhm.
So to suffer is not to be on the wrong side of God. It often means you're on the right side.
Mm.
So it's very different from what you'll find in all parts. The common temptation of human beings is to think suffering makes you on the wrong side.
Mhm.
But Robin, I have a question in the chat. Doesn't Jesus also say that it's not the result of parents' sin or the man's sin that he is blind, but so that the glory of God may be revealed through the miracle that Jesus performs? That seems kind of funky to me.
Yeah, it does to me too. And I haven't thought deeply about what Jesus said there, that it was for the miracle of God could be revealed. Maybe
never thought of it as
you could say it allows for the miracle of God to be revealed.
For the glory of God.
But doesn't it seem like God is using the suffering of that person?
Yeah, it's okay if God uses the suffering of the person as long as that's not the reason God's allowing it. So I would expect God to use my suffering and others for a greater glory. But it's not the reason. The problem is when you make it the reason God allows it, then you get into a conflict with that principle. God doesn't allow for somebody else's benefit.
I think
So it
it's
gets into a
another way.
complicated area.
I think that answer is another way of talking about the redemption of the situation.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
Hmm.
So it's a redemption.
Let's say more about
God
that.
allows it, how God redeems the situation. Because I don't think Jesus is giving,
Because that's not the way
full-fledged account
that's
there.
not the way that Jesus used miracles. Jesus refused to do miracles to just demonstrate that he was powerful. That was contrary to when people wanted him to do that, he refused. So I don't think that's the intent behind saying I'm going to perform a miracle so that God's glory will be revealed so I can show you a miracle. So I think that
Why did God wait the guy's whole life until Jesus comes along to perform the miracle?
right, that's why I think it's better taken as a statement of that this man's life will be redeemed and everyone will rejoice because of that.
Yeah, good point. You
Okay.
can look at it that way too.
All
Yeah,
right.
and so after we go through the Theodicies, we'll also be at maybe a little better position to also discuss those issues further. Why did God allow the blindness? So let me go to another one people often offer: is suffering is the result of Satan and his demons wreaking havoc on the earth.
Right.
So blame Satan. Now, I'll just say this has multiple problems. First of all, I don't think Satan's the cause of earthquakes or tsunamis or things like that. And the second problem is this, at best, even if Satan was the cause of it, it only gives you the cause of the suffering, not the why. And I can give you an illustration. Let's say somebody in like Elie Wiesel in a concentration camp and in Germany, you say, oh, he's really bothered by the suffering and how there can be an all good God and they're going through so much suffering. Oh, my solution is it's Hitler and his SS men that's causing our suffering. Probably the person that said that would deserve a slap on the face, because Wiesel would say, of course, I know that. That's not my concern. It's why does God allow Hitler and his SS men to do this to us? So even if Satan is the cause, why is God allowing Satan to do this? And so that's not going to work very well. And then the fall theodicy, a lot of people say suffering is a result of the sin of Adam and Eve. Even if that were true, that was all the, we had a perfect world before Adam and Eve, and then it's the fall of Adam and Eve. And I think that's itself is deeply problematic, because a lot of animals and things, and malaria, parasite, and others are well designed to do their dirty work. So it's not just a corruption of the world, it's a kind of would have to be a redesign. But besides that, it doesn't explain why God would have first allow Adam and Eve to fall. Well, there you would maybe invoke free will. But then why did God allow their fall to have such devastating consequences on us? I mean, usually society tries as much as they can to prevent parent sin from hurting the children. So if parent is a cocaine addict, often their children will be taken away from them. So why, it doesn't explain why God would allow their sin, which I had nothing to do with, to cause so much us to suffer.
You're really refuting Augustine's original guilt thesis.
Well, even the original, he would say we're guilty, and that would do it. So it'd be punishment for Adam
Yeah,
and
it's
Eve.
just another version of the punishment.
It could be interpreted that way, or could be interpreted as just Adam and Eve, when they fell, they corrupted the world. And now that's resulted in hurricanes and all this sort of thing. So it could be interpreted as original guilt, or it could go another way. So you hear these often.
I'm sorry, can I ask you really quickly? Don't Christians see Jesus coming to redeem the world a reversal of that sin of Adam and Eve? If so, why would the fall still be affecting us now since Jesus has come?
Yeah, well, that's an issue about atonement. Why is Jesus's atonement and just simply reverse everything? So I can give in the future, I can give a talk on atonement. But for right now, I just say that's a question on atonement. Why didn't it reverse? So there's other question, why did God allow this to have such devastating consequences? And I'm not saying there isn't I'm not saying there isn't a fall, that it didn't have those devastating consequences. All I'm saying is it's not an adequate theodicy, because it doesn't answer the key question, the why question. What greater good is that's supposed to serve, is what people want to know. So I'm going to go back here now to the free will theodicy. And here's the morally significant, authentic love of God, and point out some of its, I think, major problems. And because people usually just throw this around without thinking it through in detail. So for Christians who accept a sort of traditional theology about angels, you can kind of bring it out this way. The problem is that I'll just read it here. The major problems with the free will theodicy is that most types of evil we find in the world are not necessary for its purported greater good, authentic love for God. This is demonstrated by the existence of angels. Within traditional Christian theologies, the angels freely chose to love God, where the demons freely chose to turn away. However, the angels do not suffer from natural evil, nor does God allow the evil angels to torture the good angels, like Satan didn't torture the angel Gabriel for 1,000 years in a dungeon, at least as far as I know. Nor do they suffer from spiritual and moral darkness, not being aware of God, of what is right and wrong. So, and yet the angels, if they made that free choice, freely love God. So you can get that greater good of free love of God without allowing all these evils. That's a simple demonstration, but then you can go down here. It doesn't explain natural evil. It doesn't seem necessary for that kind of choice. What I call the extent of moral evil, what C.S. Lewis put it this way, which was a nice way of putting it. Why does God give people such permission to such permission to torture each other? So it doesn't explain that. It's like a parent can say, well, choose me freely or not, choose to love me, and if you choose to go away, leave, but I'm not going to allow you to torture your siblings, and still give them that choice. Spiritual darkness. A lot of people grow up in highly atheistic countries, like in China. You're taught in the schools that science has refuted religion and belief in God. So that's a kind of spiritual darkness. So that takes away your choice. If you don't know about God, can you have a choice for God or not God? So it would seem if free will theodicy was the story, then it doesn't seem to make sense that God would allow spiritual darkness. And then original sin, understood as a propensity to sin, coming from our fallen nature, which is those who hold the original sin, they all kind of agree with that. They don't agree with the original guilt part. That's where the dispute is. Then that seems to work against free will, not help it. And a lot of people die before they have a significant chance to choose God over not God. Like you die at 10 years old. You haven't really had much of a chance to make a choice. And then it violates the stronger principle that often if God's allowing one person's free will, like Hitler's free will, to really hurt somebody else. And so other people are being used as a means to allow Hitler to have free will. So at that, or somebody who keeps a child in the human trafficking that goes on, then the small children who are innocent are being used so that somebody else can have the free choice of choosing to do good over evil. So it has all these sorts of problems. It doesn't mean there isn't some merit to it. I mean, one of the big merits to the free will is it keeps God from being the direct cause of evil in the world. It just is this popular version. It just is too weak to cover a huge amount of evils, though all theodicies do include some kind of evil or some kind of free will, or most of them do. And that's to distance God from evil. Like if you believe God predestines everything, there is no free will, for instance, then God is the direct cause of all the evil in the world. And that seems to make God really evil, God evil. In a lot of people's minds, like God's the direct cause of Hitler's, extermination of attempted extermination of the Jews. Do you have any questions so far? Again, nothing more in the chat. Okay, so basically the free will theodicy has merit, does do some stuff, but it's just simply not sufficient on its own, I think. So let's go to another theodicy, and this will build up to two more. So there is the virtuous response theodicy that attempts to account for moral evil and natural evil. And it says those are necessary for various kinds of virtuous responses to evil, such as courage in the face of danger, or self-sacrificial love. And then that's purportedly the greater good. So if you had a world in which there isn't any evil, there wouldn't be any virtuous responses to it. There would be no need for courage. There would be no need for self-sacrificial love. So what do people think of that theodicy?
I think I kind of believe in it, or maybe I don't mean to. I don't mind if you teach me out of it, but I think I sort of think that we need danger, crisis, to sort of be proven, for us to even know who we are, know our own strengths. So I'm a sucker for that. Yeah. Okay, so the virtuous response. Anybody else? Marty's got it. Yeah. Let me say a couple of its problems. One of its problems
Marty is in the chat.
Oh, Marty's in the chat. Okay.
It's not a problem. I'm just trying not to intrude too much in discussion, that's all. But if we're created in the image of God, don't we have some of that capacity for virtuous response, or is there no relevance to Imago Dei?
Yeah, we do have that capacity. It's just whether the virtuous responses that occur in this world are a sufficient justification. Imagine that this world was it. We die. Then there's certain virtuous responses. there's so much evil in the world. A lot of people think it's hard to see how those outweigh the evil. And further, there's all kinds of unvirtuous responses, right? A lot of people that in very hard circumstances, like for example, Margaret Mee, who's a famous anthropologist, studied the Eek tribe. And initially they were quite loving people when she initially studied them, but then she went back years later, and because of deforestation, various other incursions, their life became really hard, had to struggle for food, and they just became very heartless towards one another. So that evil ended up causing unvirtuous responses. So then what you get is a mix of virtuous and unvirtuous responses. And a lot of people have a hard time. That itself is sufficient to outweigh the evil. Well, let me go into the next one, because I think, Kathleen, this might help you what you're getting at. And I want to tend to end with this one today. So what people do there is, what you can do is do some eternal good that happens because of these virtuous responses. So yeah, use this virtuous response theodicy as this intermediate step, but then say it's necessary for something else that lasts forever. So the fact that the something else lasts forever, it's an eternal good, and then it could be plausibly thought to outweigh the evils that are necessary for this. So that's the soul-making theodicy. So God allows moral evil and natural evil to get freely chosen virtuous responses to evil, courage in the face of danger, for instance, self-sacrificial love. And then those freely formed virtuous character lasts forever. The fact that it lasts forever makes it a greater good, and it needs to be freely formed. Can anybody see why you need to have the freely formed in there instead of just the virtuous character?
Yeah, there's no, yeah, of course, it has to be freely formed. I mean, there's sort of no, like if you're building bone density, you can't just give away certificates for nothing. You actually have to do the work and know you've done the work.
Yeah, well, I mean, what they would say is God could have just given us a virtuous character, but it wouldn't have been as good. It's better that we kind of, quote, earn it or
Yeah.
work towards it. It makes it more our own. So, somebody who's a child that dies and didn't have a chance to form a virtuous character, depending on your theology of the afterlife, maybe God just gives them the virtuous character. But it's better, at least it's better to be freely formed. If you don't say it's better, then God's allowing moral and natural evils not necessary for it, because God could just give it to us. So the freely formed is an essential element of this. So that's, I think, kind of gets in what you are getting at, Kathleen. I'm going to ultimately point out some, I think, significant flaws with it, but I will now just what some of its merits are. And first, I'm going to give my own cartoon rendition of it. I call it the no pain, no gain theodicy, because, like the weight room, they say, if you're going to build muscle, there's no pain, there's no gain. So there we are. No pain, no gain. That's my soul. And then some pain, some gain. And then lots and lots of pain, that was before I went into philosophy. I ran for the governor of California. But the other guy beat me. So that's your soul, lots of pain, lots of gain. And there's we have an intuitive sense about this, the truth of it, like it comes out in the picture of Dorian Gray, the novel that was made into a film. And so Dorian Gray, if I remember it right, he's given the devil or something gives him this, grants him that he can be young, stay young. And so he just starts, committing sins, going out with women, and et cetera, going out and taking advantage of them. And he has this picture in the attic, and it represents really his soul, and it grows worse and worse, goes from here to here.
Mm.
And so his soul becomes completely corrupted. And so the idea, you get this idea in the book of James, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of any kind, consider it nothing but joy, because you know that the testing of your faith produces endurance, and let endurance have its full effect, that so you may be mature and complete, lacking in nothing. So there's a suggestion of soul making there, for at least for Christians. Now, the question is, why does all the non-Christians in the world, why did, that brings up, why doesn't God just supernaturally get the gospel to them? Or does their suffering do any good? They're seeming left out of the picture.
Well, I was going to go back to Susanna's experience with cancer. I mean, the people who are saying that to her are probably thinking about something along these lines, but it just seems so heartless. And because it's not happening to them. And if it were happening to them, that would not feel like an adequate explanation.
Yeah, I mean, you might.
It's like it kind of makes sense intellectually, but it feels really heartless to say that this is breaking your soul better.
And that's not necessary. It's giving a theodicy is not the best thing to do when somebody's suffering. Often,
Right.
I mean, I think the one I'm going to give, the connection building theodicy, helps even there. But these are some of the problems. I'm gonna have to save some more of the critique for next time, because we're almost at an hour here. So here's Socrates. This is interesting. He has a similar conception. I really like this quotation about the purpose of what your actions make you what you are. So this is 500 BC. Socrates, Plato was the disciple of Socrates, one that kicked off philosophy. So here's what Socrates says. He says, let the truth be told. He's talking about evil people. They are what they fancy they are not, all the more for deceiving themselves. For they are ignorant of the very thing that most concerns them to know, the penalty of injustice. This is not as they imagine, stripes and death, which do not always befall the wrongdoer, but a penalty that cannot be escaped. And then Theodorus, what penalty is that, Socrates? We're kind of yes men in these dialogues. There are two patterns, my friend, in the unchangeable nature of things, one of divine happiness and the other of godless misery, a truth to which their folly makes them utterly blind, unaware that in doing injustice, they are growing more like one of these patterns and less like the other. The penalty they pay is the life they lead, answering to the pattern they resemble. But if we tell them that unless they rid themselves of their superior cunning, that other region which is free from all evil will not receive them after death, but they will dwell for all time here on earth in a form of life resembling their own and among a society as creatures as evil as himself, all this will sound like foolishness to such strong and unscrupulous minds. So it will. So it will, Socrates. I have reason to know it, my friend. So this idea of somehow your actions forming who you are comes into play here. So it's an hour, and so I'll finish off the soul build making next time with a critique, and then go into my own theodicy, which I try to address some of the problems
Thank you.
this has. So that will be next week. You definitely want to come next week.
Okay,
Thank you. Thank you.
thank you.
Okay. Any questions, remaining questions or anything?
I'd say if you have, make a note to ask it next week so that we can, get some grand answers from all of us to how this works.
Oh, that's wonderful. Fun.
Okay. Well, the Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Also with you.
Let's pray. Gracious God, we thank you for Robin being with us, for poking at our minds and our hearts and getting us to acknowledge some of the things that we take for granted about our faith life. We ask you to be with us now. Help us to ponder over things for the coming week and bring us together again, that next week we can share some of our thoughts, our ideas, and listen a little bit more for Robin's wisdom. We thank you, and we ask you now to go with us safely. Keep us safe as we travel, and bless us in between. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
Hey, we'll
Robin.
see you later.
Bye,
Yeah, thanks for
everybody.
coming.
Take the thing off the screen, Robin, so we can see everybody leave.
Oh, there you go. I can see anyway.
Yeah,
Yeah.
bye.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye.
So see you next week, everybody.
Great to see you.